Okay, great. Boop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doop. Go with the Ukraine. Yep. Okay, and then just go slideshow. We're good. Got it. Am I going to pop slides from here or what? Advance? Oh, I can advance from there. Terrific. Okay. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, you here and you in the Zoom world, for joining us for this chat. I was trying to think of something reasonably smart to say to start with, and the best I could come up with was I have bad news and I have worse news, okay? And the bad news is I'm going to try to accomplish something which is virtually mission impossible, and that is in the next hour, kind of give you my analysis of where things are in the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. So in 1 hour, I'm going to try to hit both those particular topics, number one. And the worst news is, and you have the opportunity to depart now if you wish, I'm not sure you're going to feel better about life when you leave here than when you walked in, okay? But I think it's only fair to give you that kind of a preview of coming attractions. We are on day 629 by my calculation on the war in Ukraine. Pretty extraordinary. No one believed this war would last this long, which is sort of a thing that happens in wars. But to give you one example, there has been intelligence gathered that Russian officers were told by their commanders back in February of 2022 that they should pack their dress uniforms because in 2 or 3 days after the start of hostilities, they'd need them for the victory parade they were planning on having in Kyiv. If those guys are still alive, and I kind of doubt they are, but if they are, I'm still hope they're lugging those dress uniforms around. Where are we right now? Well, you kind of see there, the 4 slides there, and show you that where we started, how much the Russians took initially through September of 23. You had a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the lower right-hand corner. You can't see it too well because of there we go. You can see kind of where things are right now. The bottom line, if you want to do the aggregate, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which began in June of this year, has kind of ground to pretty much not a halt, but moving very slowly. We're talking about gaining maybe 100 yards, a football field every single day at great cost. If you want a historical metaphor, you'd say this is World War I and we're in 1916. That would be probably the way to describe this. That being said, the Ukrainians have been doing some very interesting things over the last few weeks, and that is they have been expanding their attacks, what we would call in the military parlance the deep battle or a hybrid approach by using longer range weapon systems, particularly the ATACMS that we, the United States, have provided them, a missile system, the Storm Shadow provided by the Brits, another weapon provided by the French. They've been doing deeper attacks, particularly against Russian command and control, logistics, et cetera, to interrupt the flow of forces into the area they occupy in Ukraine. Now, they've also been doing a lot of attacks. The Ukrainians, particularly, and this doesn't work on that screen. Okay, sorry about that. In Crimea, and you can see where Crimea is indicated. Crimea was seized in 2014, you may recall, when the Russians initially invaded. And it has been the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, particularly in the, let's work, just in Sevastopol. Ukrainians have also struck several targets in Sevastopol, most notably the Russian naval headquarters, and they've actually hit a number of ships using not only missile systems, but in some cases, believe it or not, underwater drones, unmanned underwater drones that they have started using in that particular area. Now, that has allowed them a corridor, if you will, along the western coast there along Romania, in which they've been able to begin to export some of the grain that they've been trying to get out of Ukraine. Because initially, for about the first year or so, there was a grain agreement between the Russians and Ukrainians to allow the export of grain. Very important if you live in Somalia, Eritrea, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, okay? You depend an awful lot on the grain coming out of that particular area. In the aggregate, we think Russia, Ukraine probably export, or did export before the war, about 20% of the world's grain. Commander of the Ukrainian forces acknowledging this really recently in an article in The Economist magazine said that we're kind of at a stalemate, and this is positional warfare. Why would a commander write an article or do an interview for a major international magazine in the middle of a war? Great question. I think he did it for a couple of reasons. One, it's kind of a plea to the West, and I'll get to that in a minute, for more assistance, particularly in air defense, the ability to breach minefields, electronic warfare, etc. So it's kind of a plea to the West, hey, we need your help. And a lot of this war really, I think, is now being fought in Washington. More on that in a minute. And second, frankly, I think it's a bit of a CYA. In other words, this guy's been in command throughout the whole war. Things haven't gone too well. Well, it's not really been my fault. Again, in the aggregate, the Russians now occupy about 180 square kilometers more than they did in January. So it's about 100 miles. So a little bit more than they had initially. But the Ukrainians have made progress, particularly in the south around Kherson. About 18% of Ukraine in the aggregate occupied by Russia, but don't forget, a substantial portion of that was occupied already in 2014. Intelligence estimates. Total casualties for this war, not quite 2 years, 500,000. 500,000 dead, wounded, missing, never seen again. 500,000 people, okay? Russians probably losing 400 a day. Because they've started adopting what we call basically human wave attacks against Ukrainian dug-in positions. Overall, we believe the Russians have had over 300,000 total casualties, of that 500,000, and probably 120,000 Russian dead. Okay, this is an unbelievable total in a relatively short period of time. I mean, a year and a half is not that long in warfare. And lost a tremendous amount of military hardware, tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, you name it, tremendous amount of equipment. Talked about the grain deal. The Ukrainians have now begun, over time, what has happened, if you're a Ukrainian, is we ask you, the West, for a particular weapon, you say no, we ask again, you say maybe, we talk about it for a while, and then we eventually get it. Okay, that's kind of how this has gone. And don't forget, at the beginning of this war, Germany, for example's initial military assistance to Ukraine was to send 5,000 helmets. Okay, well, we've gone from 5,000 helmets to now giving them F-16s. But it's taken an awful long time to do that. Ukrainian pilots have begun training on the F-16 to be transferred to them probably in the early part of the new year. That will be not insignificant, but I don't think that will necessarily be a total game changer. The number of aircraft they're getting, I think, is only going to be about 60. It'll help them an awful lot in terms of air defense. It'll help them an awful lot in protecting their ground troops on the offensive. A lot of people have said, well, we gave you all this hardware, and you Ukrainians have not made a lot of progress. Well, my response is, and maybe Jamie can help me as my military colleague, I don't know of a modern war where an organization or a nation's military forces were successful on the offensive when the other side had air superiority and air supremacy. I can't think of an example, okay? And I can tell you, I commanded during the Gulf War, and we crushed the Iraqis from the air to start with. Fears that Western support is waning is the biggest concern. And I was on the phone with a guy I know who was a War College grad many years ago, who works for Zelensky, and that is their number one concern. Current state of the conflict, you see where they're advancing. Bakhmut has been, to use a colloquial phrase, really a meat grinder in terms of it has not got great military significance. It really has become of political significance. Russians looking for a win, and another little small town north of there called Avdiivka, in which again these hordes of infantry just being ground up, and you can see where the map is on the right, and that's pretty much been where the map has been, frankly, for the last 4 or 5 months, with very, very little change. One interesting change is that down there where you see Kherson, which is a very important thing because the Dnieper River is what kind of forms the boundary there, you see. The Ukrainians have managed to secure, we'd call it sort of a beachhead or whatever on the eastern bank of the Dnieper there at Kherson. That's not unimportant. To me, it's of significance not only that they've achieved it, but that the Russians haven't been able to push them back. To me, makes that a pretty significant event. But nobody knows for sure. Estimates about 25,000 civilians have been killed, including hundreds of children, not far from where Bodon comes from, the city of Lviv. The Ukrainians did kind of a demonstration in which they put out a baby buggy in a big square in the center of the city for each baby they knew had been killed in Ukraine to the best of their knowledge. And that's That's only a part of the display. The Russians have also begun doing what we call two-tap strikes. And to me, it's a total fiction, as I track almost literally on a daily basis. Russian airstrikes, when they say that we're only striking military targets, pardon my French, ladies and gentlemen, that's total bullshit. Okay, that's absolute bullshit. Okay, what they're trying to do is destroy the will of the Ukrainian people. That's what they're all about. So they'll do a two-tap strike, and a two-tap strike is you send a missile in and you hit an apartment complex. Okay, and then you wait 45 minutes to an hour, and you send a second missile in 45 minutes to an hour later. Why would you do that? Well, we want to get the firemen, we want to get all the people with the ambulances, all the people that show up. They'll be there in about an hour. So we're going to do a two-tap strike on this particular target. That's the kind of stuff that's going on here. Napoleon Bonaparte once said that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. And I firmly believe that, and that is being demonstrated in Ukraine by all calculations of population, military hardware, et cetera, where we calculate that the Russians would win. But if you sat down right now with a Russian draftee sitting in a trench who might have a helmet and a flak jacket because the Russian military right now is not capable of equipping all their soldiers with helmets and flak jackets, and asked him, what are you fighting for? I'm not sure he could give you an answer. He'd probably tell you we're trying to destroy the Nazis, even though Ukraine has a Jewish president, but we're trying to destroy the Nazis, okay? If you ask an Ukrainian what he's fighting for, they absolutely know what they're fighting for. Their families, their homes. Well, these guys in the underwear, it's a great story. A Ukrainian friend of mine teaches at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Her mom is still in Ukraine. Her mother is 76 years old. She won't leave. So she's going back to visit her. So at the onset of hostilities, this old lady, which I think is indicative of attitude, said to herself, well, what can I do? I got to be able to do something. But she was a seamstress. So she decided she was going to make underwear. So she's been making underwear every day for the last 629 days. And these guys who are Ukrainians in Bakhmut, which is where some of the heaviest fighting has been going on, found out that the underwear they got came from her. So they took the photograph outside of Bakhmut and they shipped the photograph to her. And my friend gave it to me. And to me, that's kind of indicative of attitude on one side versus the other. What's going on in Russia? Well, that's what would go on in Russia if it was a perfect world. But we thought, I think, that we would be able to affect the Russian economy more severely than we have. Now, the Russian economy is having its aches and pains. And I would argue, frankly, if Vladimir Putin was sitting here, Mr. Putin, you have lost this war strategically. There's no doubt about it, okay? You were extraction economy, an export economy before this war started. You exported oil, natural gas, some minerals. Anybody in this room got a Russian cell phone? Anybody here drive a Russian car? You got a Russian refrigerator at home? I don't think so. Okay. And in the aftermath of this war, I would even say publicly, even and there's probably some on this line, I mean no offense, even the Germans aren't stupid enough to go back buying natural gas and oil from the Russians when this is over. So in terms of your economy, I think you kind of stuck it to yourself. And the last thing you've lost is foreign investment. And if you're an extraction economy like that with energy as a basis, you need foreign investment to modernize all your extraction and reprocessing of energy supply. So they've really kind of screwed themselves, I think, in the long term. Some indications of that, a few weeks ago on one single day, the Russian central bank on one day raised interest rates in Russia 3.5% on one day. Can you imagine how the American people would react if the Fed announced this morning we're going to raise interest rates 3.5% today? That's what they did. The ruble has hit its 17th month low, and the Russians have expanded, not surprisingly, the age for conscription. They're expanding the age for conscription. They also did about a year ago, a mobilization of 300,000 reservists. Conscription, young guys who've never been in the military, drafted, brought in for a period of time. Mobilization of reservists, this guy's been in the military for a year or two, then he has to be in the so-called reserves, available to be called up later. We called up 300,000 of those people. When Putin announced that a year ago, it's estimated over 1 million young Russians left the country. all by and large young males. Many of them very, very well-educated young males. Where did these guys go? Well, they went to Armenia, they went to Cyprus, they went to Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, whatever. And you know what? They're not going back. My guess is by this time they got a Finnish girlfriend. They're working for a tech company in Helsinki, and they ain't going home, okay, to be drafted and, and called up. Furthermore, based on conscription, we know that the Russians are disproportionately conscripting people. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take Russia from the Ural Mountains westward, particularly in the northwestern portion, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, places like that, right? Moscow. Those people, they refer to themselves, they really do, as white Russians. Unlike people down in Dagestan, Ingushetia, Chechnya, or west of the Urals. Okay, that's the other people. East of the Urals, thank you. East of the Urals, got my geography wrong. Well, most of the people who are trying to draft are from east of the Urals or down in the south. Very few white Russians. The young guy from Moscow, we're not going to draft him because that might cause problems, okay? Problems. So that's kind of a problem there. You've also had, and it's not been paid attention to, but for many years, the Russians were very supportive of Armenia, particularly in a confrontation it had with a place called Azerbaijan over a small portion of Europe called Nagorno-Karabakh. And I'm sure you're all aware that the Republic of Artsakh has come to an end. I'm sure you all knew that. But it had been declared as an independent state recognized by nobody, I don't think, at the end of the Cold War. Well, the Russians have been fighting for years and years between Armenia and Azerbaijan over this small piece of territory. Russians put peacekeepers in. Russians in the last year have pulled the peacekeepers out. Azerbaijan basically rolled over them. You got about 150 to 200,000 Armenians that have fled this area into Armenia. Okay, we don't hear about that, but that's really happened. That's really a pretty significant in Central Europe foreign policy failure on the part of the Russians that just says we're too busy to deal with that right now. Again, they've announced a boost in military spending by 70%. Don't get too worried if you're worried about what that looks like. Well, in the aggregate, we're going to spend about $890 billion on defense this year. Russians will spend less than $80 billion on defense this year. So when they raise it by 70%, don't panic too much, okay? And it's going, and they even say, that's a quote, it's going to put a strain on our economy to do that. And what it's doing is, not surprisingly, it's going to squeeze out investment in infrastructure. It's going to squeeze out healthcare. It's going to squeeze out education. All the things everybody knows you run a budget. That's what happens. Foreign Minister Lavrov has accused the United States and the UK, based on the assistance we provided to Ukraine, to quote unquote being directly at war with Russia. Okay, that's the terms they use. So when they talk to the Russian people now, Putin often says, you know, this is a war with the West. This is not a war with Ukraine. This is a war with the West, in which the Ukrainians are just a proxy, a surrogate, whatever, okay? Russians have also rattled their nuclear saber several times, and as part and parcel of that, recently announced that they were going to pull out of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's a very old treaty, goes back to the Kennedy years, frankly, and thereafter, which was negotiated, finally, I think was signed in the 80s. Whereby we agree not to conduct nuclear testing of new weapons, okay? Again, I'm not too worried about this because, candidly, we Americans never ratified this treaty. We signed it, we comply with it, but no administration, Republican or Democrat, and I worked in the White House under Bill Clinton, and there was talk about sending it up to the Senate for ratification. It was never ratified because no president is going to send a treaty to the Senate if he's confident to begin with that there's no way I'm going to get 67 votes to do this. I'm not going to go up there just to lose, okay? And everybody knew that trying to ratify this was going to be virtually impossible. So the Russians really are in the same position we are, signed and complying, but they've pulled back their formal ratification of the agreement. They also pulled out of the CFE Arms Control Treaty, which I worked on a lot, which has to do with conventional forces. And the last real arms control treaty that exists, really, in many ways, is the New START agreement, which limits the expansion of strategic nuclear weapons between us and the Russians. It's a bilateral agreement. I'd say it's in grave danger. It will expire in 2026. And at that point in time, we can talk about that, what'll happen. Go figure, okay? I'm sure you're happy to learn that Mr. Putin is going to run for re-election in 2024. I think he's got a fair chance of winning. Curiously, they have not announced a further mobilization of military forces or an expansion of really a significant expansion of the number of people drafted, which really, if you look at the forces and how many they've lost, you would think they would. I think they haven't, because Putin is really concerned in the back of his mind that that might cause social unrest. So until I get through that election in March of 24, let's chill out a little bit. Okay, let's chill out a little bit. So I think that's when you're going to see that happening. Like I said, a lot of the problems right now in Ukraine, really the biggest story about Ukraine in many ways is the one in Washington, not the one in Ukraine. That's why the commanding general of the Ukrainian army wrote this article and did an interview in The Economist, basically saying, look, we depend on your military assistance, and we have provided, I think the last tranche of military hardware in total was about $43 billion. What that means is the Congress authorizes the president to spend that much or provide that much assistance, right? That total $43 billion has not been totally expended. We're down to a few $1 left. So you can see the president recently proposed a $105 billion mil aid package that included 61 billion, to Ukraine, about 14 billion now for Israel, think the Gaza Strip, 9 billion for humanitarian aid, and about 7 billion for Taiwan, all as one big package, okay? Opposition to spending more money on Ukraine has grown over the last 6 months, particularly in the Republican Party, and particularly in the House, okay? One reason why I got this elephant up there beating himself about the head and shoulders is because over this issue, you really have a civil war going on in the Republican Party, between particularly Republicans in the House of Representatives versus Republicans in the Senate. The most outspoken, in many ways, politician in the Congress in support of aid to Ukraine is Mitch McConnell, the minority leader and the Senate Republican leader, really, saying this is a no-brainer. Ronald Reagan, I'm quoting McConnell, Ronald Reagan is spinning in his grave that we're not going to provide military assistance to Ukraine. And we haven't even passed a national defense authorization. We haven't passed a budget for the coming FY, because that's still spinning around. Initially, conservative Republicans proposed the National Defense Authorization Act, but they put into it something that had never happened before. In sort of congressional parlance, the National Defense Authorization Act was always what the Senate was a clean bill. What I mean by that, it only had stuff in there that had to do with defense. We might argue between me and you as different congressmen about whether we should buy 6 destroyers or 7 destroyers, but it was all about those issues. Well, what they tried to do was they tried to tie on some additional amendments to the defense budget on abortion policy, on eliminating any kind of diversity training in the military, and any kind of assistance for people who are transgender and equal opportunity training. They tried to tag all that into the defense budget. Well, and frankly, in doing so, and this is nonpartisan, folks, I'm just calling balls and strikes here, really. In doing that, it was curious because they knew it was dead on arrival in the Senate. So we're just playing for the audience here. We're just playing for the audience, okay? And you know about the continuing resolution. Then they proposed recently a big mil aid package of about $15 billion to Israel. If we took $15 billion out of the IRS budget, which was also dead on arrival in the Senate, which also, frankly, the Congressional Budget Office, which does analysis and scores bills that have to do with finance, came back and said, if you take $15 billion out of the IRS account, we will actually lose $30 billion in revenue that we don't collect. So this bill is going to actually cost us money beyond that if you do that. Well, that was dead on arrival. And that's when the president proposed that larger package. and that's now being kicked around. I think, I don't know. I mean, what's going to happen? I don't know. We're facing a shutdown. Looks like we got over the shutdown, but we're in a total deadlock in terms of military aid for Ukraine and for Israel right now. Israelis probably not in a too bad. They have requested some aid. We've given them some smaller aid, which I think is in some discretionary accounts of about $300 million. There's 6 military storage facilities in Israel that were positioned there for us to use, frankly, in times of a contingency in the Middle East. This would be ammo and stuff like that. It was also always planned that that material could be transferred to Israel in time of need. So I'm sure probably some of that's been transferred over. And if that wasn't exciting enough, then we have the Senator Tommy Tuberville, the great senator from the great state of Alabama, who was a mediocre football coach and is less than a mediocre senator, in my opinion, holding up promotions of all senior military officers. So to the tune of about 350 general officers cannot be promoted and moved to their new assignments, to include the Commandant of the United States Army War College, who's stuck here right now, because he disagrees with the Pentagon's abortion policy. So we're going to penalize these officers over a policy that they have nothing to do with. You'll forgive me for one final comment. A lot of this arguing about spending for Ukraine has to do with money. And the argument is, well, we can't afford it. You know, we spend all this money, we just can't afford to spend all this. And we do have budgetary issues, but I thought I'd show this to you. This is, and some of you are probably as old as I am, so when I put Joe Friday up there, you all know who I'm talking about, right? You know? Yeah. Joe said just the facts, right? So these are numbers. This is not conjecture. These are numbers, okay? So that's the total outlay of the United States in the FY23 federal budget as proposed. About total, that should be 6 trillion, I'm sorry. So what do you got? Well, I got to tell you, most of the budget is mandatory spending. About 70%. So if the federal budget was a single dollar, 71 cents is already spent before anything happens. And that is, I hate to say it for a lot of us in this room, this is called Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, okay? And interest on the debt. Up there you see that, about 9%. Unfortunately, interest on the debt is getting bigger. Why? Well, as interest rates go up, the federal government's got to borrow money, so they're borrowing at a higher rate. Back in the good old days of 2% interest rates, life was good. You could borrow lots of money. So 71% of that budget is discretionary spending. And oh, by the way, since people are living longer, that particular Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that will grows uncontrolled. That grows based on people aging, okay? You know, somebody proposed a solution to that was if you get to be 60, you get free cigarettes. No. We haven't done that yet. Haven't done that yet. So when they're trying to do these budgets and they want to cut spending, okay, to make commensurate, the argument is we're going to cut spending to make up for the mill aid going to Ukraine or Israel, whatever. We're back to that 29 cents up there, that discretionary spending, okay? That's 29 cents. All right. Half of that 29 cents is the defense budget, okay? That's about $900 billion. So about half of that is the defense budget, okay? So now we're down to 15 cents of that one federal dollar left. And that is everything else the federal government does. Everything. Lights at the Congress, lunch at the White House, Department of Energy, Department of Education, Department of Transportation. Everything else the federal government's done is that 15 cents. So if you want to reduce, and we do have a big deficit problem, there's no two ways about it. I mean, we got to do something about this eventually. But if you're going to do it based on the current budget we have, you can eliminate all the discretionary spending besides defense, and our budget doesn't balance. We're still in deficit. So it's like that old saying by Yogi Berra, I know where you're going and you can't get there from here, okay? If you try to cut spending to balance the budget, we're talking about really, you can eliminate SNAP and you can, all these other things that they want to cut, you know. And it perhaps is appealing politically, but in terms of the math, it's budget dust. It's budget dust. As the man once said, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. If you want to balance that budget, frankly, folks, I'm just telling you honestly in this room, you got to look at Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the defense budget, because that's where the money is. Okay. And that's really the concern. Everything right now is in Washington. Will we provide military assistance to the Ukrainians? There's an argument ongoing right now that in some ways what the Congress would like to do is actually pass a big number, that 105 billion, as a package, because they want it to go away, so we're not talking about it in 2024, which is an election year. So let's just get that off the table by pushing through a big number. That's why the president packaged it up in one big package. Now the new speaker wants to talk about it in separate terms, so much for Ukraine's as separate bills, and then you'll be in a big struggle, okay? Frankly, I think that if they just brought it to the floor, that's the power of the speaker, his ability to reject putting it to the floor. If he brought it to the floor, it would pass, and it would certainly pass the Senate without. But there's a rule. Doug will help me. What was that guy's name? Was it Haskett, the former speaker? Denny Hastert. When Denny Hastert was Speaker of the House of Representatives, he created what was called the Hastert Rule. And the Hastert Rule is if a bill, if all of the Republicans in the House don't support the bill, we won't bring the bill to the floor. Okay. Or at least a majority. So, and if you're the Speaker of the House right now, you got about 3 guys to play with. So if 4 guys in my caucus say no, then I won't bring it to the floor because I know I won't win just with Republican votes. That's the way this game is played. Okay, where are we going? I've modified this. That's Mariupol before. That's Mariupol after. 4 possibilities I've modified slightly. Confrontation between the West and Moscow. Could we get into a nose-to-nose with the Russians? Yes. That's not off the table. Even though this kind of goes on, I noticed on the Sunday New York Times, there was nothing in the whole news section about Ukraine. The entire New York Times Sunday edition, there was not one single article about Ukraine. It's fallen off the newsprint. But that could happen. You know, airplane goes the wrong way, ships bump in the night, missile hits some wrong territory, and we're in the fifth city. Sudden collapse by one side or the other, or just a grinding war. That could happen, and we're in that kind of grinding war right now. A deal or a possible frozen conflict, perhaps, but I think that's remote. Why? Putin's waiting us out. Vladimir Putin is convinced we're going to fold. This is poker, and you guys are going to fold, and I can wait you out until the elections in 2024. Full stop. That's totally his strategy right now. And then lastly, a change in Moscow, if something happens to Mr. Putin, but also a change in Washington back to 2024, or a change in attitude in Washington. And I just don't know. I'm going to Europe in a couple of weeks. I'm looking forward to talking to some of my European friends. We, the United States of America, have described ourselves as the leader of the free world, leader of the West, leader of NATO, ever since the end of World War II. And Doug Stewart over there wrote a great book about the National Defense Authorization Act, which created a lot of that, right? Now there is growing sentiment in the United States, I believe, please tell me I'm wrong, we don't want to do that anymore. We don't want to do that anymore. Thank you all very much. We don't want to do that anymore. And that's a phenomena, but actually in a way it's sort of a historically has some antecedents. If you went back to the 1930s and you want to examine people like Father Coughlin, there was an enormous movement in the 1930s called, ready for this? The American Firsters movement. This was in the 1930s. They had massive rallies, Madison Square Gardens. There was a massive, believe it or not, American Firster meeting that was scheduled at Soldiers Field in Chicago on December the 7th, 1941. There was going to be a huge, they postponed. But be that as it may, that was a huge movement. Charles Lindbergh was one of the leaders. And this gets to an American attitude of a pox on all your houses. We've got 2 oceans, the Canadians and Mexicans. That's it. We don't want to deal with it. And maybe, just maybe, a lot of people in America are getting back to that particular attitude. We'll see. That concludes my thoughts on Ukraine. Does anyone have any questions?
Did you see the report on Sunday on 60 Minutes, how the Russians were bombing museums and churches in Ukraine to eliminate the culture, basically, of Ukraine? Do you have any comment?
I did not, but I mean, from the very beginning, and you can even go back to I think it was the Bucharest summit in 2008 or 9. And again, I keep picking on Doug because he's my old colleague. I think it's 2009, in which Vladimir Putin meets with George W. Bush, and then the discussion was whether or not NATO was going to offer kind of a relationship that might lead to eventual membership to Ukraine and Georgia. And Putin said to Bush, George, you have to understand, there is no such place as Ukraine. It doesn't exist. It's a figment of your imagination. It doesn't exist, okay? So there's been this steady drumbeat ever since this war began that this ethnicity, this culture doesn't exist, or if it does exist, we're going to root it out. So that's not surprising. There have been numerous reports by Ukrainians, and I have to say, in the Ukrainian case and also in the Gaza case, please remember one thing. As someone wisely said way back when, the first casualty of war is the truth. Okay, first casualty. So both sides got their narrative. There has been an effort on the part of the Russians to take children from the occupied areas of Ukraine, take them back to Russia, put them in Russian families, and basically make them into good little Russians. A very strong effort in the areas occupied by Russia to go into schools, totally redo the curriculum. No spoken Ukrainian, only spoken Russian. Okay, so there has been, again, that story I'm not familiar with, but it's consistent with broader efforts to really destroy this culture. Anything else?
Would you describe it as partial genocide?
Yeah, I would definitely do that. Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah. That being said, though, but I think even Vladimir realistically would look at this situation and say to himself, you know what? I can't quit because I can't afford to lose. I got to have something. I go back to my people and say, gee, didn't this go well? 500,000 casualties. Even in his wildest dreams, I think he has come to the conclusion, I can't occupy Ukraine. Occupying Ukraine, how do I control that indefinitely? How many soldiers does it take then to control that area? I might be able to control these small portions of land, Crimea, the Donbass region that I've already controlled right now. Okay, that I probably can control post-conflict. But if all of a sudden you say, okay, you get the whole Ukraine, whoa, that's and partisan activities going on, that kind of stuff. How do I control that? Similar in a way to the same question in many ways for the Israelis. Great, so you got this now. What are you going to do with it?
Is there anyone on Zoom who has a question?
Why don't we flip over and I'll make a couple comments on Gaza. How about that? Is that all right? Okay.
About this Russian situation. I'm kind of always surprised when I ask Russian friends about it. Oh, they don't. I'm kind of wondering if you have thoughts about what the Russian everyday.
Yeah. I've got some friends. One friend of mine is married to a Russian. He lives in London. Everybody's kind of keeping their head down. Okay. I mean, this is an authoritarian state. People disappear. 15,000 people got thrown in jail at the onset of the hostilities. 1 million young Russians fled the country when the conscription went up. And Mr. Putin is doing his level best to make sure that things in Russia don't change. So the average consumer is not affected. Now prices are going up, but again, we're doing everything to make sure there's no, and that's why the Ukrainians are now starting to do things, I think, to bring, as Zelensky has said, bring the war to Russia. Bring the war to Russia. Back in May, June, Ukrainians launched a couple of drones that struck the Kremlin. Now, in military terms, does that mean anything? No, didn't mean anything. But politically, whoa, that means a great deal. And that's why there's been a lot of urging to give the Ukrainians longer range weapon systems to allow them, frankly, to begin to hit targets in Russia proper. But that brings on the, that brings on the additional problem of potential escalation. Then does that bring you then into the possibility of, but I think we're going to see the Ukrainians doing more of that. They're talking about doing more of that. One of the big challenges may be, oddly enough, back to this Ukrainian thing or a Gazan thing. One of the odd things about the war in Gaza right now is we haven't seen the price of oil go up. In fact, since the war in Gaza began, the price of oil has gone down, which is sort of counterintuitive. That's really due to the United States just cracked our all-time level for oil production, so U.S. production, number one. Some increased production, I think, in Nigeria, and a drop-off in demand, particularly in China. So that's why the price of oil has gone down. But that doesn't mean it's still not potentially something that could go adversely. Ukrainians are talking about striking Russian energy supplies because come this winter, I guarantee you, what the Russians will begin doing is trying to destroy the energy infrastructure all across Ukraine. They want the Ukrainians to spend a very cold, dark winter. That's what they want, which is desire to. There you go. Just hit slideshow. We're good to go. Hit slideshow from the beginning. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was messing you up.
How can I get to ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ask the question. Ask the question.
Someone else is asking a question. Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Hello?
Yeah.
This is George Ryan. I can understand you clearly, but I cannot understand any of the questions here on Zoom of the people who are asking. If they would speak louder or get closer to the microphone, it would be a lot better for us out here in Zoom world.
I'll repeat the questions. I'm sorry, sir. Forgive me. Okay, I'm going to transition to talking about Gaza real quick. Just give you kind of a snapshot view. Because I work for CBS Radio and TV, I have had to spend a lot of time on this one as well. We know what happened on the 7th of October. We know by the Israeli admission about 1,200 Israelis were killed. It's impossible to describe how horrific that attack was. I could spend an hour just ruining your lunch on details. I won't do that. I will tell you two stories. There is a report that one of the hostages is a 3-year-old American kid whose parents were killed, and the child is still a hostage. There's another report that at least one pregnant woman was taken hostage who has subsequently now delivered her baby while in captivity. And there are reports that several of the hostages, don't know how many, have been killed in the fighting since this began. Israeli airstrikes, artillery, whatever, okay? And there is a report this morning of a possible deal to release some of the hostages, probably women and children. They're talking 70 to 80, the numbers I hear. That deal would probably reflect then an Israeli pause in hostilities for some period of time. Some people are saying like 3 days, or possibly the release of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. Now, at the onset of the war, the Israelis had about 6,000 Palestinians in jails all across Israel. So whether that will come together or not, I don't know. That's the contours of what I hear is being talked about. Qatar and Egypt are negotiating it. You have to begin this by asking the fundamental question, why did they do this now? Okay, why did they do this now? Because things seem to be pretty peaceful in relative terms. There had been a recent negotiation prior to the hostilities between Hamas and Israel, and they do negotiate with each other over administrative things, which expanded the number of people living in the Gaza Strip that could go across the border daily and work in Israel. They just raised that by a few thousand, so things seem to be pretty specific. Why would they do it now? Well, I think first of all, Hamas assumed that Israel was not paying attention, which they weren't, okay? And that they were torn by dissension over the efforts by the Netanyahu government to undermine the existing court system. And you had these demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of Israelis all across the country. And so you're not paying attention, and they weren't. That being said, and that they would not come together. That half of the assumption was wrong. Secondly, I think Hamas finally came to the conclusion, look, we were elected in 2006, which they were by a popular vote, to govern Gaza administratively, though the Israelis still control all access, air, land, sea. And Hamas is not bothered to have a subsequent election, oh, by the way. So we can either be the administrators of this place, or we can be the voice of the Palestinian people writ large, but we got to be able to do one of the, we got to change the brand here. Okay, so we need to be the voice of the Palestinian people, the ones that put the Palestinian issue back on the table because it's slowly sliding into oblivion. So by making this attack, the issue now is back on the table. There's been more talk about a two-state solution in the last 30 days than there's been in the last 4 years, right? Thirdly, they were worried about a possible agreement whereby Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Israel. If that occurred, part of that would be some effort to at least improve the lives of Palestinians. It would probably be through the Palestinian Authority and not through Hamas. So who would be the face of the Palestinian people? Palestinian Authority, and we would be marginalized. Okay, we, Hamas, would be marginalized. And then they also, I think, hope that they would, and this is a phrase they use, create a conditions of so-called permanent war. So by attacking Israel as we did, this would then result in across the region rising up in behalf of the Palestinian people in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, Iran, et cetera, and this would be a permanent revolution to destroy the state of Israel. We're not just trying to, gain a little territory. No, we're out to destroy the state of Israel. Make no bones about it. And finally, don't forget, this is a Messianic, Sunni-based terrorist organization. So they knew the Israelis would strike back. They knew that militarily they probably weren't going to win. But hey, we are all martyrs. So that's great. The thing about jihad is you get to go to your great reward, and sadly there's going to be civilians killed along the way, but they're going to be martyrs too. So that's some consolation, I guess. So that's the best I can tell you about why they did that then. You got to kind of step back and say, well, where does this all come from? And what does this look like? Well, to start with, the Gaza Strip. Think 3 times the size of the land area of Las Vegas, and you got the Gaza Strip. Cram 2.2 million people into a size twice the size of Vegas, okay? Gaza City, 13,000 people per square kilometer. Now, the only I think 2 old soldiers in this room are me and Jamie. I can't think of any place worse to conduct military operations than an urban setting of 13,000 civilians per square kilometer. Okay, that's about as bad as it possibly gets. Where did they come from? Well, where they came from is in 1948, the state of Israel was proclaimed independent. And from their perspective, hundreds of thousands, some say 1 million, of Palestinians were forced from what is now the territory of Israel into the Gaza Strip. That's where they came from. And they were told at the time, this is going to be temporary. Hello, temporary, 75 years ago. For Palestinians, this is referred to as the Nakba, which in Arabic means catastrophe. And Palestinian families, prior to hostilities, had a ritual whereby you would keep the keys to your house back in Israel. And as you got elderly, you would bequeath the keys to your children because eventually they were going to go back. This is just social attitudes that I'm trying to drive at. So you see the unemployment rate. So my point is, I think you need to know where this came from because we're going to have to figure out where this goes to. Military force, if you forget everything I tell you on this call today, please remember the following. Military force is a means. It's not an end. Unless you want to kill everybody and turn it into a cemetery. It's a means to an end. So as you're conducting military operations, you want to be thinking about what is the end state I'm trying to shape, okay? Otherwise, as we used to say in Washington, you're forever stuck not answering the most fundamental question, which is, and then what? The most fundamental question when you do policy is, and then what? What do we do then? Which is what the Israelis, I think, in many ways, are struggling with, though in my opinion, not struggling as hard as they should be. Where we are right now. Israelis came in, as you can see, up in the northwest, the northeastern corner of the Gaza Strip and the northwestern corner, came in along the coastline. They also came in east-west above this line, above the a Besser stream you see there, and basically bisected the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip, I think 25 miles long by 6 miles wide. That's about what it is, as a rectangle. So we cut it in half, okay? And that became an exclusion zone just south of Gaza City. And we told all the Palestinians living in Gaza City, 600,000 or so, that they should flee south. That's what we did, okay? About 1,400 Israeli dead. I'm saying that it's 1,200 that were killed before the war started. My estimate, the Israelis have lost probably 100 or so since then. The Israelis do not give any, the Israeli Defense Forces do not give any reports of casualties. They do not report anything on their casualties. Estimates, 11,000 Palestinians killed, 29,000 injured. That comes from the Palestinian Health Authority, controlled by Hamas. Is that number correct? Who knows? Okay. Some people in the Biden administration go, not sure it's correct. The Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs in testimony the other day said, may be higher, because a lot of people are buried under rubble and we haven't been able to count them all. About 1.5 million of the 2.2 million people living in the Gaza Strip, about 1.5 million are displaced, and they've been pushed south, okay? It has been, so most of the fighting has been in the north, but the Israelis have conducted some missile airstrikes in the south. About 221 hostages, we talked about that. Israeli civilians in the north. The war has also expanded somewhat in the north because in southern Lebanon is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Shiite-based terrorist organization supported by Iran. More on them in a second. And they have begun launching artillery, mortar, and some missile attacks against northern Israel. In response, the Israelis have evacuated about 125,000 Israelis out of the northern portion of Israel. Ground in half, conducted airstrikes, and the Israelis, in response to Hezbollah, have conducted airstrikes in southern Syria as well as in Lebanon, because Hezbollah is using both locations. In the last 24 hours, we've had a level of violence, particularly around the Al-Shifa Hospital. Al-Shifa Hospital, you can see it up there in the upper left-hand corner, just where it says Gaza City. If you look to the left, that's the Al-Shifa Hospital. The largest hospital in the Gaza Strip. By the time the Israelis had isolated, reports right now, it's pretty fragmentary, about 650 patients there, thousands of refugees, and then 1,000 or so staff of this hospital. Has been a point of great controversy. Hamas saying it's just a hospital. The Israelis have been hitting it with some artillery fire occasionally. Israelis saying it's a Hamas command and control center. Israelis are now conducting operations in that, and it's a complex. It's not like a one hospital building. It's a complex of buildings, okay? So we'll see. But this is a point of enormous controversy because of the questions of international law. To give you some kind of idea of the level of violence, let me lay this on you. Israel has so far intercepted, since the war began, 9,500 rockets and missiles have been fired at Israel, have been taken out. 9,000. Some have gotten through, but they've taken out 9,500 have been shot at them. Okay. Israeli Air Force, beginning on the 14th of October, has dropped over 6,000 bombs on targets in the Gaza Strip. Okay. Twice the size of Las Vegas. To give you a little comparison, we dropped 7,000 bombs on Afghanistan in the 2019, which was one of the largest bombing years in the war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the size of Texas. So 6,000 on Vegas or 7,000 on Texas. So you get the idea, kind of the intensity of what's been going on here. To give you another way of looking at this, people compare what's happening to the battles in Fallujah and Mosul during the wars in Iraq. That picture down in the lower left-hand corner in Fallujah, I took that picture. I was in Fallujah right after the fighting ended, and that little boy was coming through the wire trying to return to the town after the fighting had ended. He dropped his soccer ball, he ran back through the wire, grabbed his ball, and I just snapped the picture as the kid was running back through there. What's the point? Being a refugee is not a good deal, okay? And we went into Fallujah, 80% of the population, it was a city of about 200,000 or 300,000, 80% had left. So it's a different equation if you're a military guy, if 80% of the civilians are gone, okay? There were about, we think, 500 to 1,000 so-called insurgents in Fallujah. It took us 6 weeks. We lost 100 guys killed in action and 500 wounded, okay, in 6 weeks. Mosul, 2016, controlled by ISIS, 2 million people, about 4,300 people per square mile, so still not as dense as Gaza City, okay? There were about 3,000 to 5,000 ISIS fighters in Fallujah. Took the Iraqi army with US air support 9 months. They lost 8,000 killed in action to take back Fallujah from ISIS over 9 months. So if you want to take the Gaza Strip from north to south, good luck. Good luck, okay? And you see the figures for the Gaza Strip in comparison. And, oh, by the way, estimates Hamas has 25 to 30,000 fighters in the Gaza Strip. So about 10 times the size of ISIS, okay? And there were no tunnels in Fallujah and Mosul. And finally, if you look at the picture of Mosul, and the same was true for Fallujah, when I was in these places, the tallest building in town was always the minaret on the mosque. Okay, that goes without saying. Besides that, the tallest building, about 3 stories in Mosul and Fallujah. Now, if you've seen any video or any photographs of the Gaza Strip, we're talking 8, 10-story buildings, okay? If you clear this in urban operations, when I was in Fallujah, as you went down the street with my security force, every building had 2 enormous black X's painted by the front door. Why were they there? That was to tell you that building had been searched twice. Every room had been entered, every closet, every basement, every attic, every crawl space in that building had been searched twice. Now think about doing that in a city of 300,000 people. And then let's go to 2.2 million. That's the kind of thing you got to do to make sure you haven't left any opponents, any enemy behind you, or they haven't stored explosives, or haven't stored weapons, or they haven't put in, tripwires or whatever. You got to do that. That level of deliberate operation is what we're talking about. So taller buildings, and Hamas has, we estimate, about 200 miles of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip. I'm going to go a couple minutes over. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll be quick. So now where are we going? That's where we've been. Where are we now? Where we're going? Okay. Israelis talk a lot about the Six-Day War in 1967, great Israeli military success, and they're very proud of that, and they should be. But we may be going to the 6th-front war if you're the Israelis. Okay, 6 fronts. Front number 1, Gaza. Front number 2, lots of unrest on the West Bank of the Jordan, the occupied territories. About 150 or more Palestinians have been killed since this war began on the West Bank in fighting with Israeli forces. Settlers on the West Bank, Israeli settlers living on the West Bank, doing independent attacks on Palestinians. Benjamin Gvir, the Minister for National Security for the State of Israel, has been seen on the West Bank handing out free automatic weapons to Israeli settlers, okay, just to make sure they're ready to go, okay? Watch that space. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, mentioned that, more on that in a second. The Houthis in Yemen have now launched at least 3 missiles against Israel. They've been intercepted by the Israeli air defense systems, but Yemen is shooting at Israel right now, okay? A conflict with Iran in Syria and Iraq, and I'll get to that in a second in terms of the strikes against American forces in those areas, and the information war and the war at home. One of the fascinating things about this conflict, and I think people in the 21st century really need to understand, is you fight the war in the information space. On the 7th of October, Israel had enormous global support, and as they should have had, following the horrific things Hamas did. That curve has gone almost 180 degrees. Lower right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, that's the West Bank. That's not Gaza, that's the West Bank, okay? Lower right-hand corner, that's the demonstration on Remembrance Day, 11th of November, in London, in opposition to the ongoing hostilities in the Gaza Strip. But yesterday there was a demonstration on the National Mall, and you had 250,000 Americans in support of Israel. But the information war and the war at home. War at home, I would tell you, Israelis that I talk with are very angry with their government. My prediction, Benjamin Netanyahu as a politician is toast. Okay, they are. You let us down. You let us down. You were not watching what was going on. You were You were raising all this social unrest, which encouraged them to do that. You let us down. So there will be a day of reckoning, I think, politically, for him when that's over with. And then finally, back to what are you going to do next? Well, here's what the former head of Israeli intelligence said. The way right now, the way things are going, we'll be fighting their sons in 4 or 5 years. Listen to an NPR report the other day. They were interviewing a young refugee, 13-year-old Palestinian kid, lost his family. And the interviewer said, what are you going to do? And the kid looks at the interviewer and said, I'm going to grow up and be a freedom fighter. He didn't say I'm going to grow up and be a terrorist, by the way. He said, I'm going to grow up and be a freedom fighter. That's what I'm going to do. So it harkens back to that great fabled comment by Donald Rumsfeld one time during the war in Iraq, to be crude. Are we killing them faster than we're growing them? Is one thing you have to worry about. Okay. Now, this is pretty busy. It's just to give you an idea. That's kind of what we're talking about. Terrorist groups. We're talking about terrorist groups that in many cases, folks, are better armed than many countries around the world. Hamas has 150,000 rockets and missiles in southern Lebanon. I've been up on the border with Syria, all pointed at the state of Israel. They have 100,000 fighters. They're at least twice to 3 times the size of Hamas. So if they get into this in a big way, it's going to be something. Okay. They also have anti-ship missiles from the Chinese. Why is that important? I'm telling you what, as a military guy, if I'm the commander of the USS Gerald Ford in that carrier battle group in the Eastern Mediterranean, I'm paying real close attention to what Hezbollah is doing with those anti-ship missiles. I'm paying real close attention to that. But in terms of expanding war, popularly very strong opposition to any kind of war in Lebanon. Lebanon is an economic basket case. You may remember the big explosion in the harbor a year or so ago. They've never really recovered from that. People don't want that, but kind of what we're doing here is playing Russian roulette. What I mean by that is one side gets lucky, fires a missile and kills 20 or 30 people, and then you go into escalation. So far, at least, that hasn't happened, but I still think it's like that rolling that cylinder every time this happens. Unrest in the West Bank, Houthi missiles I talked about. The Islamic resistance in Iraq has claimed it attacked Eilat, which is the Israeli port on the Red Sea. That's been unconfirmed. You just had a big Arab summit in Riyadh. And the interesting thing about that one was we, in a matter of 30 days, have gone from being very close to an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize relations to the president of Iran going to Riyadh, first time an Iranian president had done that in 11 years, and having a private set of discussions on improving relations with Saudi Arabia and a separate private discussion with the president of Egypt about normalizing relations. So we've gone from normalizing relations with Israel to closer relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that's happened over 35 days. Okay, that's a pretty big shift. Massive demonstrations around the world, you know that. And the Russians and the Chinese are loving it. I'll just leave it at that. They're loving it. Okay. U.S. forces in the Middle East, and then I'm going to come to a close pretty fast. We got about 45,000 Americans all across the region. That number has gone up by about 10,000 since this began. You can see where they are. Point of greatest concern, forces in Iraq and Syria. About 2,500 in Iraq, about 800 or so in Syria. Those forces there have nothing to do with the war in the Gaza Strip. They are there advising the Iraqis in Iraq and conducting operations in eastern Syria to destroy the last remnants of ISIS. That's why those guys and gals are there. Also recently, to expand our forces, we sent over more air defense. A second carrier battle group, the USS Eisenhower, arrived. So you got 2 carrier battle groups. That's a lot of firepower in the Eastern Med. The Ike is going to go down through the Red Sea and will end up on station in the Persian Gulf as a reminder to the Iranians, you don't want to get into this. That's what that's all about. And we've also had a nuclear-powered submarine arrive in the Persian Gulf for the first time in a long time. And we've had B-1 bombers conducting aerial operations, aerial training over what we call the CENTCOM AOR area of responsibility. So a lot of U.S. presence in the region, increasing U.S. presence in the region, saying, you all want to be cool. You all want to be cool. That has resulted in American forces being struck about 50 times by rockets, drones, mortars since the war began in Syria and in Iraq. We have had about 60 or so, best I can keep track of, U.S. military personnel who've been injured. Most of that have been concussions, mild concussions. We have not had anybody killed, but once again, I'm back to Russian roulette. One of those Shiite gunners gets lucky, kills 25 Americans. We go to Fifth City, I would argue, pretty fast. We, the United States, have launched 3 retaliatory raids, aircraft strikes against targets, so-called targets, storage areas for weapons for these Iraqi Shiite militia groups operating in that area, supported by Iran, largely supported by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. So we've done 3 airstrikes in response, but they continue to fire at us. So this is a point of concern. And oh, by the way, we just lost a drone, one of our big surveillance drones, a Reaper, was shot down by the Yemenis. Global, we talked about oil. Oil really has gone down, but I'd watch this space. If things go bad, Persian Gulf gets shut, Straits of Hormuz, Iranians get into a conflict, price oil could go up to $100 a barrel, $150 a barrel overnight. Impact on the Israelis. The value of the shekel actually went down and actually has rallied as the Israelis kind of pull together. Longer term impact on Israel, I think socially, politically, economically, it's going to be something interesting to watch. And it will be, like I say, I believe the end of Benjamin Netanyahu. So with that, I'm going to stop and take a couple of questions, and I want to get out of here because I've taken up too much people's time. Thanks for all your help, sir. Did I make you all feel better?
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. Any questions from somebody?
Any questions from the Zoom crowd? They all went to sleep.
Thank you, Jeff.
We're afraid of what your answers will be.
Okay.
Yes, I have a question.
We have a question. Yeah.
Yeah, this is George. I have a question about Ukraine. We read every day from a number of sources about how many Russians have been killed in the past day, past week.
Yeah.
We never hear that much about Ukrainians.
Yep. Right.
What's the impact of all of this on their manpower, and what is the future prospect of their manpower?
You kind of faded out, George, but I think you're talking about Ukrainian manpower. Yeah, kind of like, it's interesting. Like the Israelis, Ukrainians have not regularly published casualties. Okay. Estimates are they have suffered about 200,000 casualties. That's killed and wounded. They initially, when the war began, put restrictions on travel. So if you're a male, I think it was between 18 and 60, you were not allowed to leave the country. At the beginning of the conflict, there were about 12 million displaced Ukrainians, about 5 million outside of the country, about 7 million within the country. Of the 5 million who left Ukraine, 80 to 90% of them were women, children, and elderly, because young males were not allowed to leave. So yeah, they have a strain on the manpower as well. And this is I think why Putin is so sanguine about the fact that we can wait you out, because obviously, bluntly, he doesn't care too much about casualties on his side. He remembers that great phrase by Joseph Stalin, who once said, "Don't forget that quantity has a quality all its own." But yeah, that he thinks he can wait them out as well because of larger population. Any other questions?
What do you think about that?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about that?
Well, that's good. That's a very good question. Ukrainians are casualty sensitive. What I mean by that, they're not going to do the human wave attacks that the Russians are doing, okay? So they're more sensitive to it. So it'll affect how they conduct military operations to a degree, number one. Number two is, by opinion polling, as much as you can believe that, about 80% of the population of Ukraine support this war, continue to support this war, okay? One of the things that the government in Ukraine, by the way, has got to decide is there's supposed to be an election, presidential election in Ukraine in 2024. Zelensky is supposed to run for re-election. There's been talk back and forth on whether or not that happens. Do they extend the date? So it's unclear whether that will occur. But clearly, they do not have endless manpower. And clearly the, Russians outnumber them by a factor of 2 or 3, just in sheer people. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
I have a question. I wonder the extent that you believe Iran was involved in Hamas' decision to commence this conflict.
Yeah. Honestly, Boz, they knew something was going down, but I don't think they were in the precise planning of the operation. Now, there have been some suggestions that they were. Wall Street Journal, for example, at the beginning of the war, ran a series of articles claiming that, the Iranians were directly in control of or assisting in the actual planning of the operation. As time has gone on, I more and more doubt that. I would describe the relationship between Hamas and Iran as Hamas is a client, Hezbollah in Lebanon is a proxy. Okay, first of all, Hamas is a Sunni-based terrorist organization, and obviously the Iranians are Shiite. Hezbollah is a Shiite-based organization. Okay, and that religious difference is not unimportant. People point to the fact, well, Iran provides Hamas military assistance. That's very true. That's very true. Best of our calculation, they were giving Hamas about $100 million of military aid on an annual basis. But to be fair, the United States gives Israel $3.5 billion of military aid on an annual basis. So they were giving them military assistance, but as things have unfolded, I think less and less that they were directly involved in the planning and execution of it. If they were involved in it, I think there would have been a much more closely coordinated effort with Hezbollah and Nasrallah in Lebanon. They have responded, Hezbollah, in firing missiles and rockets, as I said, but Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, speaks once a week. He always speaks on Friday during Friday prayers. And his speeches so far have basically said, well, this is terrible and we support Hamas, but what we're going to do is we're going to try to tie up as many Israeli forces here in the north so they can't be sent to the Gaza Strip, but has never suggested he's going to send 100,000 Hezbollah fighters across the border. To be crude about it, I would say his comments have kind of been, yeah, we support you and we'll fight this war to the last Palestinian and tell it how it all turns out. But they have not been directly involved. Had Iran been much more closely involved in thinking this out more broadly, I think they would have a much more coordinated response. But on that one, I could be wrong.
Thank you.
very much, Jeff.
Yep.
In 2 weeks, we'll have Ed Webb from International Studies at Dickinson talking specifically about the war between Israel and Hamas. And he's a media specialist. He will also tell us about misinformation that's being distributed about this war.
Well done. Thanks, sir. I'll get hold of Ed and let him know what I did. I'll talk to
Okay,
Ed.
that'd be great.
That way there was more.
He knows what you did.